The summer of '62, I was 10 years old, and the days stretched out long and golden, tasting of dust and wild mint. Our town, Havenwood, was nestled deep in the valley, a quiet huddle of wooden houses and cobbled lanes clinging to the broad belly of the Copper River. It wasn't a grand river, not like some of the giants my pa spoke of from his travels, but it was our river. It was the heart of Havenwood, a shimmering living ribbon that gave us everything. It turned the mill wheel that ground our corn, carried the flatboats laden with our timber to market, and in its cool depths, the fat copper salmon swam, filling our nets and our bellies. My name's Liam. Most days you'd find me down by the riverbanks, a battered fishing pole in hand, my patched breeches stained with mud and ambition. The sun would beat down, hot and heavy, making the air hum with dragonflies. Old man Tiber, the mill owner, would shout cheerful greetings as he passed, his voice rumbling like the millstones themselves. The women would be clustered by the washing rocks, their laughter echoing off the water, the scent of lye soap mingling with the sweet smell of river algae. It was a good life, a simple life, bound by the gentle rise and fall of the river's tide. This particular summer, though, felt different. It started subtly, like a pebble dropped into a calm pond, sending out ripples you barely noticed at first. The rains. They had been coming for weeks, not the sharp, sudden downpours that cleared the air and fed the thirsty fields, but a soft, insistent drizzle, day after day. It wasn't enough to make us run for shelter, just a persistent dampness that seeped into everything. The earth, usually cracked and dry by July, remained stubbornly soggy. The air, instead of being crisp after a shower, hung heavy and humid, trapping the smells of wet earth and growing things. Even the Copper River, usually a clear greenish-brown, began to take on a strange, milky hue, like clouded jade. Pa, a man who saw the world through the practical lens of a farmer and a boatman, was the first to voice his unease. He'd stand on the porch each morning, hands on his hips, gazing at the bruised sky. "Too much water," he'd mutter, his brow furrowed. "The ground can't take no more. It's soaking up like a sponge." Ma would just nod, her lips pressed into a thin line. She worried more about the crops, the wheat fields turning yellow, bowed low with the constant moisture, threatening to rot before harvest. But Pa's concern went deeper. He'd lived by the river his whole life, and he knew its moods. He'd seen its temper before, though never quite like this. The river, our constant companion, was changing. Its usual gentle murmur had deepened into a low, continuous growl, a sound like a distant, restless beast. The water level crept higher each day, swallowing the sun-baked rocks where I usually cast my line. The reeds along the bank, usually upright and proud, now leaned heavily into the current, their green tops almost submerged. My favorite fishing spot, a cluster of mossy boulders where the salmon liked to gather, disappeared beneath the churning surface. The familiar landmarks of my childhood summer were slowly being erased, one by one. The older folks in town started to talk. Whispers floated through the air like dandelion seeds, carried on the damp breeze. Tales of the great flood of '29 resurfaced, stories of houses swept away and lives lost. I'd overheard them sitting on the porch, pretending to be engrossed in carving a wooden boat, but every word sank deep into me. They spoke of the river rising beyond its banks, of water creeping into homes, of people scrambling onto rooftops, waiting for rescue that sometimes never came. Old Martha, who ran the general store, swore her grandmother had seen the river turn black with mud and rage during that flood, carrying away everything in its path. Her eyes would get wide and rheumy as she recounted the tales, and a shiver, cold as river water, would trace its way down my spine despite the summer heat. I asked Pa about it one evening, after the lamps were lit and Ma was patching my trousers by the firelight. "Pa," I'd begun, my voice small, "will the river really take our house?" He'd paused, his needle hovering over the fabric. He looked at me, his strong, weathered face unusually somber. "The river's got a memory, son," he said, his voice low. "And sometimes it remembers what it was like before we built our homes on its banks. It remembers being wild." He didn't say yes, but he didn't say no either. The silence that followed was heavier than any spoken word. The animals seemed to sense it too. The birds that usually sang their cheerful songs from dawn till dusk were quieter, their calls more anxious. Squirrels scurried with frantic energy, stuffing their cheeks with nuts, their eyes wide and nervous. Even the dogs in town, usually playful and boisterous, lay listlessly in the shade, their ears perked, listening to something only they could, hear in the increasingly restless rumble of the Copper River. The very air felt charged, expectant, as if the world was holding its breath. One afternoon, I walked down to the river alone, drawn by an irresistible, almost morbid curiosity. The water was now lapping at the very edge of the lane that ran along the bank. It was no longer jade-colored, it was a sullen, angry brown, thick with churned-up earth, carrying bits of debris, broken branches, clumps of sod, even a lost fishing bobber. The current was unbelievably strong, pulling and tugging at the banks, eroding them bit by bit. It wasn't the friendly river I knew. This was something else, something ancient and powerful stirring beneath the surface. I saw a large oak tree that had stood on the bank for as long as I could remember, its roots exposed and clawing at the air where the earth had given way. It looked like a desperate hand reaching for help. A sudden, sharp crack from upstream broke the silence. It sounded like a giant whip. Then another, closer this time. It was the sound of trees, their roots finally losing their grip on the waterlogged earth, tumbling into the swollen river. A cold dread settled in my stomach. It wasn't just rain. It was a force, gathering strength, coming for us. I ran back to the house, my heart thumping against my ribs like a trapped bird. I burst through the door, my voice a breathless gasp. "Pa! Ma! The river! It's taking the trees!" My parents exchanged a look, a silent communication of shared fear. Pa stood up, his gaze drawn to the window that faced the river. The normal sounds of Havenwood, the distant clatter of the mill, the faint shouts of children playing, the lowing of cattle, seemed muffled, distant. They were being drowned out by the rising roar of the Copper River. The sky above us, which had been a pale, insistent gray all day, was now turning a bruised, ominous purple. A chill wind, carrying the metallic scent of coming rain and the damp, earthy smell of the river, swept through the valley. It felt like the very air was pressing down on us, heavy with unspoken warning. The summer of '62, which had begun with the promise of endless play, was slowly, inexorably, turning into something else entirely. Something cold, something dark, something that felt like the end of everything we knew. The river was no longer just a friend. It was a looming threat, a silent beast awakening, its roar growing louder with every passing moment. The ominous purple bruise of the sky finally burst. It wasn't rain that fell, but a relentless, solid sheet of water, as if the very clouds themselves had ripped open. The sound was deafening, a percussive drumming on our shingled roof that drowned out every other noise. The gentle drizzle of the past weeks was a memory, replaced by a violent torrent that hammered the earth with an astonishing force. The wind, which had been a low moan, now howled like a furious animal trapped in the valley, rattling our windows and making the whole house groan and shudder. Pa's command was sharp, cutting through the din. "Liam, help your mother bring in the last of the food stores. Ma, we've got to get everything off the main floor." There was no panic in his voice, only the hardened resolve of a man who knew he was in a fight he might not win. I scrambled to follow his orders, my small hands clumsy with the rush of fear. I helped Ma drag the heavy sack of dried beans and the salted meats from the pantry, their weight a solid, reassuring comfort against the looming chaos. Lyra, my little sister, sat in the corner, her face pale, her hands clasped over her ears, against the furious roar outside. She was just 5, and this was not the gentle summer she knew. Through the rain-streaked window, I could see the street transforming. The lane, usually a dusty track bordered by sun-baked earth, was now a flowing stream, a miniature river carving its own path toward the main road. The water was a milky brown, the color of weak coffee, and it carried with it a swirling froth of leaves and twigs. The neighbors were moving too, their dark figures a flurry of activity in the downpour. Old Man Tiber was trying to secure the mill's door with a thick chain, his small frame dwarfed by the massive wooden structure. I saw Mrs. Gable, a widow with a prize-winning garden, desperately trying to pile her precious potted geraniums onto a porch chair, her face a mask of frantic determination. We were all fighting our own small battles against the same enormous, indifferent enemy. Pa came back inside, his oilskin coat streaming with water. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving with exertion. "The animals are safe," he said, his voice strained. "They'll be dry in the high barn for now." He went straight to the window, peering out at the river. I joined him, standing on my toes to see over the sill. The sight stole my breath. The river had swallowed its banks entirely. The great familiar stone markers, the ones that had stood, proud and defiant for as long as I had lived, were gone, submerged beneath a churning, violent expanse of brown water. The roar was no longer a growl. It was a hungry, guttural bellow. The Copper River had become a monster. The water first seeped under our front door, a dark, sinister stain on the wooden floorboards. Then it was a thin trickle, a tiny, watery snake crawling across our home. Within an hour, it was a wide, rushing tide, a silent, powerful presence that lapped at the legs of our chairs and stole the rugs from the floor. Ma gave a small, choked gasp and pulled Lyra close. There was no more time for saving things. Our home was no longer a sanctuary, it was an island, and the sea was rising. Pa helped us climb the narrow stairs to the second floor, a place we usually only used for sleeping. The view from the upstairs window was even more terrifying. The street was now an impassable river, a churning current that carried not just leaves, but larger, heavier things. A wooden crate, a splintered fence post, and a child's rocking horse, bobbing like a grim, helpless specter in the furious flow. Havenwood, the town I knew, was gone, replaced by a chaotic brown sea that stretched from our porch to the foot of the distant hills. My father's face was a mixture of despair and defiance. He knew we were in grave danger, but he refused to surrender to it. He turned to us, his eyes piercing and serious. "We're safe for now," he said, his voice a steady anchor in the storm. "This house is old and strong, it'll hold." He was trying to be reassuring, but his gaze kept returning to the water level outside, which seemed to be creeping higher and higher with every passing minute. We huddled together in the upstairs room, a small family unit against the overwhelming force of nature. Then, just as darkness began to fall, a sound ripped through the thunderous roar of the rain and the river, a splintering, tearing sound of wood and stone giving way. It came from the direction of the mill. Pa, his jaw set, turned from the window. He didn't need to say anything. We all knew. Old Man Tiber's mill, the heart of our town, the sturdy, venerable structure that had stood for generations, was no more. The sound was followed by a chorus of frantic shouts, faint and desperate, carried on the wind. It was the sound of our neighbors, now truly isolated, truly afraid. The flood was no longer just an inconvenience or a creeping threat. It was a reality, a devastating force that had begun to take pieces of our world. And it was only just beginning. The summer of '62 was not going to be just a flood. It was going to be a reckoning. The river was reclaiming its memory, and we, the children of Havenwood, were standing in its way. The night that followed was a black, endless expanse, punctuated by the furious roar of the river and the relentless drumming of rain. The mill's final, splintering cry had been a signal, the end of the world as we knew it. After that, the sounds of destruction began to multiply. We heard the groaning, tearing shriek of timbers as another barn, likely the one belonging to the Peterson family, gave way to the current. There were faint, choked cries carried on the wind, not of a full-throated scream, but the desperate, wordless sound of people witnessing the unraveling of their lives. Each sound was a new stab of fear, a new piece of our world being broken and taken away by the churning brown torrent. We huddled in the upstairs room, the only place left in our home not claimed by the flood. The oil lamp flickered weakly, its small light a fragile defiance against the total blackness outside. The house, our sturdy old home, was now a small boat, rocking gently on a terrifying, unknown sea. The water outside slapped against the foundation, a relentless, hungry sound that seemed to be trying to get in. I sat with my back against the wall, my knees pulled up to my chest, my arms wrapped around them. Lyra lay asleep, or pretending to be. Her head nestled in Ma's lap, her small body trembling. Ma's hand stroked my sister's hair, but her gaze was fixed on the window, a silent testament to the terror that held us all captive. Pa paced the room, his long shadow stretching and shrinking with the flicker of the lamp. He was a man of action. A man of the river, and his helplessness in the face of this overwhelming force was a raw, palpable thing. He'd built his boat with his own hands, navigated these currents 1,000 times, but now his hands were tied, his knowledge useless. He went to the window again, peering into the chaos. The rain had lessened slightly, but the darkness was absolute. I could see the faint, distant flicker of a lamp in another house, a brief, fragile spark of human life in the vast, churning sea. Then, with a shudder, the light vanished, swallowed by the darkness. I held my breath, a cold dread creeping into my heart. "Who was that, Pa?" I whispered, my voice barely a thread. He didn't answer right away. He just shook his head slowly, his jaw tight. "The river's taking its toll, son," he said, his voice a low, heavy rumble. "It's a hungry thing tonight." He was right. The river had a new color now. In the faint, scattered glow of moonlight that managed to pierce the cloud cover, I could see that the water was no longer just brown. It was a deep, sullen red. Not the color of blood, but the color of the iron-rich clay of the riverbed, scoured and torn from its ancient resting place. The river was running red with the lifeblood of the earth itself, a grim message from a world that was being unmade. I thought of the stories old Martha had told, of the river turning black with rage. This was worse. This was the color of a wound, a terrible, gaping wound in the heart of our valley. The river was not just rising, it was consuming the very soil of Havenwood, pulling it down into its churning depths. It was erasing our past, our history, the very ground on which we had stood. The smell was different now, too. A sharp, metallic scent mixed with the smell of wet earth and the sickly sweet smell of rotting vegetation. It was the scent of destruction, of a world in the process of dying. Pa finally stopped pacing and sat on the floor, his broad back against the wall. He stared into the darkness, his hands resting on his knees, his face unreadable. I watched him, my heart aching with a pain that was more than just fear. It was the pain of seeing a giant humbled, of seeing a protector brought to his knees. He was the strongest man I knew, the man who could fix anything, who could navigate any storm. But this was a storm of a different kind, a storm that he could not fight. Just then, a heavy thud shook the house, followed by a loud scraping sound against the side of the wall. Lyra whimpered. her small body trembling against Ma's chest. Pa was on his feet in an instant, his hands gripping the windowsill. He peered out, his face a mask of intense concentration. "It's the livestock pen," he said, his voice grim. "It must have broken loose. It's pinned against the house. Our livestock, our last bit of security, our future, was caught in the torrent. Their small corral a fragile, groaning barrier against the river's immense power. We could hear the frantic bleating of a goat, a thin, desperate cry of terror that was swallowed almost immediately by the roar of the water. Pa looked from the window to Ma, then back to the window, his mind racing. He was a man of the river, a man who built his life on its banks, and he would not let it take everything from him without a fight. He saw a chance, a small, impossible chance to save something, and his spirit of defiance, which had been dampened by the night, began to flicker back to life. He looked at us, his eyes filled with a fierce, unwavering love. We were a small island in a vast, terrifying sea, but we were together. And in the face of the river's rage, that was all that mattered. The night was dark, the river was running, red, and the world was falling apart. But the story of Havenwood, of our family, was not yet over. We were still here, fighting for a tomorrow we might never see, but fighting nonetheless. Pa's decision was made in a flicker of an eye, a moment of fierce resolve that cut through the fear-laden silence of the room. The frantic bleating of the goat was a sound he couldn't ignore, a desperate cry that echoed the helplessness we all felt. He wasn't just going to save our livestock. He was going to save a small piece of our world, a small piece of himself, from being completely consumed by the river. Ma's protest was a choked gasp, a hand reaching out to grab him, but he was already gone, moving with a speed and purpose that was terrifying to behold. He grabbed a thick length of rope and a sturdy axe, and with a last grim look at us, he slid the window open, the roar of the river rushing in with a sudden, deafening force. I watched, my face pressed against the cold, wet glass of the window, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Ma held Lyra close, her eyes wide with a terror that I had never seen before. Outside, the world was a chaos of wind, water, and darkness. The river, now a churning, furious torrent, was a living, breathing thing, its red, muddy waters swirling with a malevolent energy. The livestock corral, a splintered mess of wood and rope, was pinned against the side of our house, groaning and straining against the immense pressure of the current. The bleating of the goat was now a thin, ragged thread of sound, a fragile gasp for life in the face of the overwhelming noise. Pa was in the water. He was a powerful swimmer, a man who had navigated these currents his whole life, but this was not the river he knew. This was a force of nature, a monster that sought to consume everything in its path. The water was waist-deep, cold and thick with the red clay of the valley. He fought his way toward the corral, his body a small, struggling point of light in the vast darkness. The current pulled at him, threatening to drag him under, but he moved with a grim determination, his muscles straining against the impossible force. I watched as a piece of debris, a large, jagged piece of timber, rushed past him, missing his head by mere inches. My breath caught in my throat, a silent scream of terror trapped in my chest. He seemed to be fighting not just the water, but the very spirit of the river, a fierce, angry entity that had finally risen from its slumber. He reached the corral, his hands grasping at the splintered wood. The bleating of the goat was closer now, a raw, desperate sound that seemed to fuel his strength. He fastened the rope to a sturdy beam of the corral, and with a great heave he began to pull, his face a mask of straining muscles and fierce determination. He was trying to dislodge it, to push it away from the house before it could batter its way through the foundation. But the corral was heavy, and the river was a merciless opponent. The wood groaned, a sick, splintering sound, but it would not move. Pa didn't give up. He took the axe, and with a grim resolve, he began to chop at the rope that held the corral to our house, the same rope that was now a battering ram. He was trying to set it free, to let the current carry it away, even if it meant losing our livestock. Every strike of the axe was a small, sharp stab of sound in the overwhelming roar of the river, a desperate act of defiance against the relentless power of the water. He worked with a frantic, terrible speed, his body a testament to the enduring will to live. Finally, with a loud, tearing crack, the last of the rope gave way. The corral, with its trapped, frightened animals, was suddenly free. The river, with a sound like a great sigh of relief, grabbed it and pulled it away, a splintered ghost disappearing into the darkness. Pa, his body exhausted, his face a pale, strained mask, made his way back to the house, his movements slower, more deliberate now. He was a man who had stared into the heart of the river's rage and had returned, bruised but alive. He slid back through the window, his body shaking with cold and exhaustion. Ma, with a choked sob, rushed to him, her hands searching his face for wounds, for signs of hurt. He had a deep gash on his arm, a jagged wound from a piece of splintered wood, and his hands were raw and bleeding from the rope and the cold. He looked at us, his eyes filled with a new kind of fear, a fear that was not for himself, but for us. He had won a small victory, but it had come at a great cost. He was no longer just Pa, a man who lived by the river. He was a warrior who had faced a monster and had returned to tell the tale, a living, breathing testament to the fierce and terrifying power of the Copper River. The summer of '62, I realized, was not just about the flood. It was about the stories that would be born from it, the stories of survival and loss, of courage and fear, of a river that ran red with the heart of our valley and the blood of a man who refused to let it take everything from him. The dawn that followed the endless night was a cruel and silent thing. The torrential drumming of the rain had finally ceased, and the furious roar of the river had softened to a low, relentless groan. In the quiet, the sounds of our own fear seemed amplified. We had spent the night tending to Pa's gash, wrapping it tightly with a torn piece of cloth that Ma had boiled in water from our remaining stores. His face was pale, his body exhausted, but there was a fierce, unwavering light in his eyes. He had stared into the heart of the river's rage and had returned, bruised but not broken. The small victory had cost him, but it had also given us a sliver of hope, a desperate belief that we, too, might endure. As the first light of day filtered through the clouds, a new kind of terror began to sink in. We could finally see the world, outside. I climbed to the window, my small face pressed against the cold glass, my breath fogging the pain. What I saw stole the breath from my lungs. Havenwood was gone. The familiar streets, the neat rows of houses, the green fields that stretched to the hills, all were submerged beneath a vast, muddy expanse of churning red water. The river, no longer contained by its banks, had swallowed the entire valley. Our house was a solitary island in a desolate sea of ruin. Where our neighbor's house, the Petersons, had stood, there was nothing but a scattering of splintered wood and a lone, broken shutter. The rest of their home was gone, swallowed by the flood. I saw a crib, a child's small bed, bobbing precariously. In the distance, a heartbreaking testament to a life upended. I couldn't tear my eyes away. The river's color, which had been a terrifying mystery in the night, was now a shocking reality in the cold, gray light of morning. It was a deep, sullen red, a color that spoke of a deep and terrible wound in the heart of our valley. The river was running red with the iron-rich clay of our earth, but it felt as if it was running red with something far more precious. The silence was the most terrifying part. The relentless drumming of the rain and the fury of the wind were gone, replaced by an eerie stillness. The only sounds were the lapping of water against our house, the groaning of stressed timbers, and in the far distance, the faint, mournful cries of survivors. The cries were thin, desperate threads of sound, carried on the damp air, weaving a new, tragic tapestry of our community's grief and loss. The shouts of, "Pa, Ma, are you there?" were met with silence. The flood was no longer just a physical threat. It was a psychological one, isolating us, separating us from the community we had known and loved our entire lives. Pa, his arm bandaged, joined me at the window. He didn't speak. He just stood there, his face a grim mask of shock and sorrow, his eyes scanning the horizon. He was a man who had known this land his entire life, but now he was looking at a foreign, unrecognizable world. He was a boatman, a hunter, a protector, but in this moment, he was a man lost in a world he no longer understood. He saw the remains of a chicken coop, a few drowned chickens still clinging to the wreckage, spinning slowly in a whirlpool of debris. He saw a barrel of corn, our winter store, bobbing helplessly in the churning current, on its way to a fate we would never know. He saw the very foundation of our existence, our livelihood, our history, being washed away, one small piece at a time. Ma came to the window holding Lyra in her arms. She looked at the devastation, her face a mask of grief and horror, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. She didn't have to say anything. We all knew. This was not a storm we could rebuild from in a few weeks. This was a complete and total destruction, a complete and total loss. The summer of '62, which had begun with such promise, was now the flood of death, a name whispered by the elders that was now a brutal, terrifying reality. After a long time, Pa turned from the window, his face set with a new kind of determination, a quiet resolve that was more powerful than any storm. "I have to go," he said, his voice low and serious. Ma's protest was immediate. "No, Pa, you can't. It's too dangerous." But Pa just shook his head. "I have to," he said, his eyes meeting hers. "There are others out there. They need our help, and we need them." He was a man of the river, and the river, even in its rage, was his home. He was going to use his small, sturdy skiff to navigate the new, terrifying landscape of our valley, to find the lost, to help the injured, to be a beacon of hope in a world of despair. He was going to face the river again, but this time, he was not going to fight it. He was going to use it. And as I watched him prepare his skiff, a small, battered boat that looked impossibly fragile against the vastness of the flood, I knew that the story of Havenwood was not over. It was just beginning a new, terrifying, and heroic chapter.